Alright, hey everyone, how y'all doing? I'm going to be looking for this paper at the problem of Daoism and the existence of the self. So, the general problem is something I think that's actually kind of hard to talk about. It's something, we usually sort of take for granted, so we don't really have good language for it. But the basic problem is there some real entity, some thing that is the self, or the I, the subject, the ego, whatever you want to call it? Is there a real me? Is Jeremy this sort of real, sort of unique individual, a sort of determinate ego or person? And if there is a real self, what is the nature of this self? And, there's some sort of standard theories that usually get kicked around that say it's the subject of experiences, or sort of perceiver, someone that sort of sits and watches. Or is it a rational agent, the thinking part that sort of stands outside of, say, the laws of nature, say, if you like Kant's? Is it the sum of, say, our past choices and experiences? The existentialists are big on this. Jean-Paul Sartre, this is sort of his view, or the philosopher Jose Ortega, who says here, man, in a word, has no nature. What he has is history, right? So the self is just sort of the sort of collection of our past choices and experiences and thoughts and feelings, and we sort of continually make the self as we go along. Or on the other hand, is the self just sort of an illusion, a construct, not a real thing at all? That it's something we sort of posit or sort of make up to sort of deal with or sort of explain the sort of bundle of experiences, perceptions, affects, personas. A view that people like Hume and Nietzsche think this, that there is no real self, that it's just sort of a collection of experiences that we sort of lump together and call the self. So Zhuangzi talks a lot about this problem of selfhood, but it's not immediately obvious what he thinks. Zhuangzi likes to talk in metaphors, and he tells little stories. He sort of gestures at what he believes, without really explicitly coming out and saying what his view of the self is. So there's a fair amount of interpreting we have to do here. And so I've picked out a couple lines that sort of suggest for Zhuangzi that there is a real self. So this line from chapter 7. Perfected people use their minds like mirrors. And this, I think, sort of recalls from the Platform Sutra, Shen Tzu's little verse, that the mind is this sort of separate thing that what we ought to do is make it like a mirror, so it sort of becomes sort of indistinguishable from the world out there, but it's essentially a separate thing. At least that's one way to read this line. Or, from chapter 6 here, the big lump burdens me with a form, labors me with life, eases me with old age, and rests me with death. And this view at least reminds me of Kant's view of the self, the sort of the noumenal self that sort of stands outside of the world, but there's also the sort of phenomenal self that's sort of buffeted around by the sort of the trappings of life, by the forces of nature. And so that, that we are sort of, in a sense, victims of everything that goes on in life. And that's what I think this verse could be read to be getting at. But there are some other lines that suggest that there is no self. So in chapter 5, in this conversation between Huizi and Zhuangzi, Huizi asks, can people really have no essence? And Zhuangzi says, yes, they can. The way gave them a face. Heaven gave them a form. So the idea there being that, we have these sort of bodies, these faces and forms, but no real essence. There's no real sort of substantive content at the bottom of those faces and forms. Or, there's in chapter 6, Yan Hui says, I cast off my limbs, dismiss hearing and sight, leave my form, abandon knowledge, and unify them in the great comprehension. So that the ultimate point here is to sort of throw off all these sort of things that we sort of ordinarily associate with ourselves, like our bodies, our perceptions, our thinking, the things we learn, and just sort of abandon ourselves in a way to sort of the great all there. Now, in my view, Zhuangzi believes that there is no real self, that the self is just a construction of ours, because we, in our way, sort of run around dividing up the world into concepts, picking out objects and values, and sort of divvying things up like this, and the self is just one of those concepts that we have invented for ourselves. But Zhuangzi thinks this illusion can break down at times, and that sort of will reveal to us the unreality of the self. So there's this little story Zhuangzi tells of Zhuangzi and the butterfly, that where Zhuangzi says, "I was sleeping and I dreamt I was a butterfly, and I woke up and I couldn't tell whether I had dreamt that I was a butterfly or whether the butterfly was dreaming that it was me." And the point I take of this is not really this sort of Cartesian anxiety of, how will I ever know if I'm dreaming? Is this real or am I dreaming? The ultimate point, I think, for Zhuangzi is that this sort of anxiety about not being able to tell shows us that really there's no, difference there. There's no sort of self-dreaming of things or of being dreamed of. That it's all just sort of one thing. Or, from, as we saw in the last slide, Yan Wei talking about sitting and forgetting and sort of throwing off all these elements and concepts of the self that we have allowed to pile up on top of ourselves. So I think Zhuangzi is saying that the self is impossible to catch hold of. It has this sort of slippery quality of, am I dreaming, am I being dreamt? Because it doesn't exist at all. And in distinctions like dreaming or awake, the self, the outside world, these are invented by us. They're fictions, but they're not actually real. And so for Zhuangzi, the point is to get rid of or to forget those distinctions and return to the oneness of the vacant sky. And that once we sort of throw off this sort of idea of the self as opposed to the outside world, we can sort of be one with anything. We can return to the oneness of everything, to the sort of eternally changing nature, to the Tao. And that, I think, is his main point. And this line from Kangzi in chapter 6, I think, really sort of captures what Zhuangzi thinks of the self. Kangzi says, "We say I, but how do I know what I mean by I? You dream you're a bird crossing heaven or a fish sunk in the depths. There's no telling if the one who speaks now is awake or dreaming. Step aside and leave the changes. Then you will enter the oneness of the vacant sky." And this I take to be emblematic of Zhuangzi's final position, that the self is this fiction, this sort of creation of ours, that there is no sort of unique I in opposition to everything else. And that once we get rid of this fiction of ours, then we will sort of see the world for what it is and sort of be with the world for what it is, the Tao. And that, I think, is what Zhuangzi's ultimate view of the self is.